my younger son who works as a pilot, called me that morning and said in a confused voice, "Mom, something very strange is going on." And when he told me that my daughter-in-law was at the house, I calmly answered that she was upstairs taking a shower, but then he lowered his voice and said, "That can't be right, Mom, I have her passport in my hand and she just got on my flight to France." And at that exact moment I heard footsteps behind me, which made my heart skip. Earlier that day had started like any normal day, with me cleaning up after breakfast while my older son Stephen had already gone to work. My grandson Matthew had been picked up by the school bus, and Araceli had gone upstairs saying she was going to take a quick shower. When the phone rang, I was happy to hear Ivan's voice during his short break at the airport, and we chatted about his flights and his busy life in the air, just like we always do. He sounded cheerful at first, but then he hesitated and told me something didn't make sense, that he had just seen Araceli travel on his flight, which left me completely confused because she had spoken to me only minutes earlier. I was so sure she was still in the house, yet his words and the sound of steps behind me made me realize that something was very wrong and that this ordinary morning was about to turn into something I could never have imagined. He stayed silent for so long that I could hear his breathing on the line, and when he finally spoke, his voice was serious and full of shock as he said, "Mom, this can't be a mistake, because I'm holding her passport right now and she just boarded my flight to France." I laughed at first, sure he was confused, and told him gently that he must have mixed someone up because I had just seen Araceli a few minutes earlier and she had told me she was going to take a shower. But Ivan didn't laugh with me this time and began to explain slowly that after all the passengers had boarded, he went back to look for some papers and found a passport near the gate. And when he opened it, he froze because it had Araceli's name and photo inside. My heart started beating faster. Yet I still tried to convince myself it had to be a misunderstanding and asked him if he was really sure, even though a strange worry had already started to grow inside me. Ivan then said he went to check the cabin himself and saw her sitting in first class next to a well-dressed man, talking closely like they were together, and those words made my head spin. I stood there gripping the phone, unable to understand how that could be possible because I had just heard her voice upstairs in my own house. And right then, as if to confuse me even more, the sound of running water stopped, a door opened and Araceli called out from upstairs, asking who I was talking to, while my heart raced so hard I thought it might jump out of my chest and I realized something very strange was happening. That I told him it was just a friend and quickly walked into the living room, not wanting Araceli to notice my face. She was standing on the stairs with wet hair looking at me with curiosity. I closed the door and spoke quietly into the phone, trying to stay calm even though my hands were shaking. I told Ivan that Araceli was here, that I had just heard her and seen her, and asked him if he was truly sure about what he saw. There was a long silence, and when he finally answered, his voice was serious and firm. He said there was no mistake and that the woman was sitting right in front of him on the plane. My mind went empty. I ended the call and stood there for a moment, feeling weak and confused. The house suddenly felt too quiet and too heavy, even though the sunlight was coming in through the windows. I sat down, trying to understand how the same person could be in two places at once. If Araceli was here, then who was on the plane? And if she was on the plane, then who had been in my house? A few minutes later, Araceli came downstairs wearing a clean blue dress and spoke to me in her usual kind way, asking if I needed anything from the market. I answered her and tried to smile, but inside I felt uneasy and restless. She took her basket and left, and I stood there watching her walk away, feeling like something was very wrong. I trusted my son and I also trusted the woman who lived with me, but now I couldn't explain what was happening. I sat alone in the living room as the sunlight made lines on the floor, thinking that maybe there was a secret in this house that I had never seen before, and for the first time in a long while, my home did not feel completely safe. The old armchair where I always sat to knit or read stories to Matthew suddenly felt uncomfortable, as if it no longer welcomed me the way it used to. Ivan's phone call kept repeating in my mind and every word he said felt heavy on my heart. I slowly looked around the living room at the family photos on the wall. Stephen and Araceli on their wedding day, Matthew as a newborn, and Ivan smiling proudly in his pilot uniform. Those happy memories which once brought me comfort, now felt distant and unclear. My name is Stella Brooks, I am 65 years old, and I have lived alone in this quiet neighborhood in Phoenix since my husband Raphael passed away 10 years ago. He left me with two sons who are my whole world. Stephen, the serious and hardworking architect, and Ivan, who followed his dream and became a pilot. My daily life has always centered around Stephen's family, my daughter-in-law Araceli, my grandson Matthew, and the calm routine of this house. For years I believed Araceli was the perfect wife and mother. Always neat, always polite, always caring toward Matthew. I still remember their wedding, a simple but beautiful celebration in her parents' yard, where everyone did their best to make the day special. When she first came to live with us, she seemed confident and full of life, and I truly thought we were lucky to have her. But after she left for the market that day, I stayed sitting at the table, holding the cloth tightly without realizing it, and Ivan's call made me start noticing things I had ignored before. There were times when Araceli would leave saying she was going out, and when she came back her mood felt completely different. Some days she was kind and warm, playing with Matthew and taking care of everyone, and other days she was easily annoyed and would get upset over small things. I always told myself this was normal and tried not to think about it. But now my thoughts were tangled and it felt like someone had quietly changed the meaning of my memories. I even remembered a small detail from months ago. One day she wrote the shopping list with her right hand, and suddenly I realized I could no longer be sure about the things I thought I knew. Her handwriting used to be tidy and steady, but one day I noticed something strange. She was writing with her other hand and the letters looked shaky, like someone who wasn't used to holding a pen that way. I remember asking her gently when she learned to write like that, and she laughed it off, saying she was just trying something new. At the time I didn't think much about it, but now that small moment felt important. I was still lost in my thoughts when Matthew came home from school, running in with his bag bouncing on his back and a big smile on his face, proud that his teacher had praised his drawing. I hugged him and tried to smile even though my heart felt heavy. He opened his notebook and showed me 2 pages, explaining that his mom had helped him one day with neat writing and the next day with messy writing, using different hands. When I saw the pages my stomach tightened, but I made an excuse and told him she was probably just tired. Then he looked at me with his honest little eyes and said that some days his mom was very loving and other days she seemed distant, and that worried me even more. Not long after, the doorbell rang and it was my neighbor Mrs. Collins returning a plate, mentioning in a friendly way that Araceli had handed it to her with the opposite hand, even though she knew she usually didn't. I invited her in for tea and tried to act normal, but her words stayed in my head. After she left, I sat down feeling weak and overwhelmed, as if too many small signs were piling up at once. Later that afternoon I went into the garden to water my flowers, hoping the quiet would calm me, but as the sun began to set and the shadows grew longer, my thoughts only became heavier, and I knew deep inside that something in our home was not the way it used to be. The words of Mrs. Collins and Ivan's serious voice on the phone would not leave my mind, and they kept going around in my head while I stood in the garden pretending to water the plants without really seeing them. I started asking myself if I had become too old to notice what was happening in my own home, or if I had been choosing not to see things because I wanted so badly to believe we were still a happy family. When Araceli came back from the market with her basket, I immediately noticed she was holding it with the other hand, even though I clearly remembered she always used the same one for cooking, cleaning, and fixing Matthew's hair. I watched her set the basket down and asked what she had bought, trying to sound normal while my chest felt tight. She smiled and said she had bought tomatoes, herbs, and fish and that she would cook my favorite dinner, and everything about her sounded kind and polite, yet I kept watching her hands, unsure of what I was seeing. At dinner, Stephen talked about work, Matthew chatted about school, and Araceli acted calm and thoughtful, even reminding Stephen about a school meeting, but inside my head Ivan's words kept repeating and I could not push them away. A few days later, when Matthew accidentally knocked over a glass of water, I laughed and told him it was fine, but Araceli suddenly spoke in a cold, sharp tone and scolded him, which shocked both me and Stephen, and in that moment I felt certain that something in our home had quietly changed, even if no one else wanted to admit it yet. She turned toward us with anger in her eyes and complained that Stephen always took Matthew's side and that she was the one who ended up looking strict and unfair, and the mood at the table instantly became uncomfortable and heavy. Matthew dropped his head and his eyes filled with tears, and when I pulled him close, my heart hurt because only a few days earlier Araceli had been so gentle and caring with him, and now she felt like a different person. I sat quietly beside her, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, thinking about how some days she was kind and patient, and other days she was cold and distant, and even small things like which hand she used kept changing in a way I could not explain. I kept telling myself to stay calm, but every time I looked at her, she felt more like a stranger than the woman I had lived with for years. A few days later, as I walked Matthew to school, he suddenly stopped and told me in a sad voice that one day his mother helped him with his writing kindly and carefully, and the next day she would not even look at his work and told him to do everything alone. And when I tried to comfort him, my own voice shook because I did not understand it either. That evening at dinner, Araceli pulled out a small notebook and started writing with her other hand, and even Stephen noticed and joked about it, which made her freeze for a second before she laughed it off and quickly hid the notebook, though I clearly saw worry in her eyes. From that moment on, even Stephen seemed more thoughtful, and I sat there holding my spoon, pretending everything was normal while my doubts quietly grew stronger. A few days later, I took an empty spice jar back to Mrs. Collins' house, and when she invited me in for coffee and made me sit down, I had the strange feeling that I was about to hear something that would only add more questions to the ones already filling my heart. Mrs. Collins' kitchen felt warm and smelled of fresh coffee, but I could not relax at all because my mind was full of worry, and when she looked at me seriously and quietly asked if my daughter-in-law had changed, my heart started beating faster. She explained that some days Araceli greeted her kindly and even asked about her children, but other days she walked right past her without even a look, as if she did not recognize her at all. And although I tried to brush it off with a weak excuse about young people being busy, deep inside I knew Mrs. Collins was not the type to imagine things. I stayed a little longer, barely touched my coffee, and went home feeling heavier than before, and on the way I stopped at Mr. Johnson's bakery to buy Matthew his usual treats. But even there, Mr. Johnson told me that one day Araceli had been sweet and full of praise for his bread, and the very next morning she came in cold and left without even saying thank you, and I walked out of the shop with shaking hands, realizing too many people were noticing the same strange changes. When I got home, I made some tea and sat on the porch, breathing in the soft smell of the flowers from the garden, and when I saw Araceli returning from the market and greeting me in a flat, distant voice without her usual smile or cheerful words, I felt a quiet fear settle in my chest because it was becoming harder and harder to believe that everything was normal in my house. But inside I couldn't stop watching her closely. Today she wore a navy blue blouse, completely different from the white one she had on when she left that morning. I asked gently, "Why did you change your blouse?" Araceli paused for a moment, then quickly said, "Oh, I got a stain so I had to change," and hurried into the kitchen with a half smile. I stood there holding my teacup, my chest tight, feeling like a weight was pressing down on me. Everything, from Mrs. Collins' observations to Mr. Johnson's story, and now the odd way Araceli answered me, made it impossible to ignore the strange details anymore. That evening at dinner, Matthew chatted happily about school, but Araceli barely responded, just nodding silently. When Stephen asked if Matthew was done eating so I could clear the plates, Matthew looked at me and said softly, "Grandma, yesterday Mom sang me the lullaby, Quito Lindo, and it sounded so beautiful, but tonight she didn't sing it." I stared at Araceli as she served herself, her expression unreadable, and Matthew's words hit me like a jolt. Only Araceli and I knew that song, and yet she had sung it yesterday but not today. Why the sudden change? I began clearing the plates, but my mind kept racing through the times she had left the house claiming to see a friend and returned with a strange look, or brought flowers she said a friend had given her, or snapped at me for small things. I used to dismiss these moments, but now they seemed like fragments of something bigger I couldn't yet understand. After tidying the kitchen that night, I sat at the dining table with an old notebook and began writing, my hand trembling slightly. 3 p.m., Araceli leaves for the market. Returns 6 p.m. wearing blue blouse, irritable mood. Yesterday she sang to Matthew tenderly. I kept writing because I could no longer pretend nothing was happening. I had to track these strange patterns and figure out the truth for myself. Today she was cold, didn't sing, and every word she spoke felt heavier than usual, reinforcing the doubts I had been trying to push aside. My old notebook was now filled with observations about Araceli, every line a mark of suspicion, a record of the strange patterns I couldn't ignore. I sat in the kitchen staring at it, my heart heavy, feeling like the walls were closing in on me. I couldn't keep these thoughts bottled up any longer. I needed someone to listen, someone who would understand without judging or jumping to conclusions. Immediately I thought of Carol, my best friend since we were young, when we used to sit under a tree knitting and sharing every detail of our lives. My hand shook as I picked up the phone. "Carol, are you free this afternoon? Let's meet at the coffee shop on the corner. I need to talk." He didn't hesitate. "Of course, Stella." I knew something was wrong. "Wait for me, I'm on my way." I felt a small wave of relief, but the worry still pressed on me. Wrapping my old shawl around my shoulders, I walked to the little coffee shop where Carol and I had spent so many hours laughing, crying, and sharing our hearts. The familiar dark wooden tables and rich smell of roasted coffee welcomed me, but I felt hollow inside. I chose a corner table, away from prying ears, hugging my cup of coffee as if it could keep me grounded. How could I explain all this? How could I admit that I was beginning to doubt the woman I had trusted for so many years? When Carol arrived, her light sweater and fresh vegetables in her bag seemed almost cheerful, but her eyes were sharp, warm, and focused on me. "Stella, I can see it in your face. Something's very wrong. Come on, tell me." I took a deep breath, trying to steady my voice as I summarized everything. Ivan's call from the airport, Araceli's passport, the woman who looked exactly like her on the plane, and all the little details. The way she switched hands when writing, her sudden shifts in mood, her coldness or sweetness at different times. I handed her my notebook. "Look, I wrote it all down. I don't know if I'm imagining things, but I can't ignore it anymore." Carol flipped through the pages slowly, her brow furrowed as she read every shaky line. "You've noticed everything, Stella," she said quietly but firmly. "I don't know, Carol. I just feel scared," I admitted, my voice trembling. "Scared that Araceli is hiding something, and scared that if I dig too deep our family could fall apart. But I can't stop thinking about it. I have to know the truth for Stephen, for Matthew." Carol put her cup down and looked me straight in the eyes. "Stella, no one can fool a woman like you easily. What is your gut telling you?" I swallowed hard. Something isn't right. There's definitely something going on. My voice dropped to a whisper. "But what if I'm wrong? What if I hurt Stephen?" Carol's expression hardened. "Trust yourself. If you don't find out the truth, you'll always live with that doubt, and you won't be able to protect Matthew or Stephen." Just then Mrs. Jenkins, the friendly vegetable seller from the market, walked in and spotted me. "Mrs. Brooks. What a coincidence. I saw your daughter-in-law at the market last week. She was so kind, even bought extra cilantro. But this morning she came by looking so serious, didn't even say hello. Is something wrong?" I forced a smile. "She must have been tired, Marie," I said, though inside I felt like I was sinking. Once she left, I turned back to Carol, panic still in my eyes. She squeezed my hand gently. "See, Stella, it's not just you noticing this. Keep writing everything down, and if you have to, you may need to follow her. Not to hurt her, but to protect your family." I nodded, though my chest felt heavy. The thought of tracking my own daughter-in-law made me feel like a traitor, yet I knew she might be hiding something. That afternoon I returned home, still unsettled. Araceli left carrying her usual red basket. "Mom, I'm going to the market for a bit," she said softly. I nodded and watched her leave, opening my notebook to write. 3 p.m. Araceli leaves for the market, red basket, normal behavior. I stayed by the window, counting every minute. At 6 o'clock she returned, but the basket in her hand was now blue. I raised my eyebrows. "Did you switch baskets?" asked, surprised. She smiled lightly and replied quickly, "Yes, the other one broke and a friend lent me this one," then hurried into the kitchen, leaving me uneasy and even more determined to track these strange inconsistencies. I nodded, but my hands were trembling as I added to my notebook. Returned 6 p.m. carrying a blue basket, voice a little hurried. Each note felt like a step closer to the truth, yet also a step away from the image of the trusting, loving mother I had always been. That weekend, Stephen left early for overtime and Matthew was at a school activity, leaving the house quiet, just Araceli and me. I kept busy cleaning the dining room table, trying to push away the doubts gnawing at me, but then Araceli appeared in a pale yellow floral dress, looking as fresh and composed as she had on her first days of marriage. "Mom, I'm going to the market for a bit," she said softly, taking her wicker basket. I nodded, smiling, but a voice inside me whispered, "Follow her, Stella. Find the truth." Without thinking twice, I draped my old shawl over my head and stepped out, trailing her at a careful distance. The sun beat down, sweat soaking my back, but I didn't care. I only wanted to see where she was really going. Araceli walked quickly along the usual cobblestone street, but instead of turning toward the market, she veered left into an alley in a working-class neighborhood. The houses were old, close together, paint peeling, tin roofs rusted. My heart raced as I crouched behind some bicycles on the sidewalk. She didn't glance back and moved into a narrower alley where sunlight barely reached. I hid behind a mechanic's shop, watching her stop at an old wooden door, knock softly and disappear inside. My breathing was ragged, my head spinning. Why was she here? This wasn't the market and none of the friends she mentioned lived here. I wanted to approach to ask her directly, but my feet felt frozen. The fear of discovering a truth that might shatter everything held me back. Defeated, I turned and walked home, each step heavier than the last, questions piling up in my mind. When I finally pushed the gate open, I froze, sensing that the answers I feared might be closer than ever. When I came back into the kitchen, Araceli was there, chopping vegetables, wearing a crisp white blouse, completely different from the pale yellow dress she had left in. Her frown was sharp, her eyes cold as she glanced at me. "Where did you go, Mom?" "You're just getting back," she said. I froze, my mouth dry, unable to form a proper answer. Just minutes ago I had seen her walk into that alley in the yellow dress. How could she be back so quickly dressed like this? I just went for a walk," I stammered. She nodded silently, but the intensity of her gaze sent chills down my spine. I retreated to my room under the pretense of looking for something, though really I needed to calm the racing of my heart. That evening I was knitting when Matthew burst into my room, cheeks flushed from playing outside. He clung to my legs, tears rolling down his face. "Grandma," Mom yelled at me just for dropping a pencil. Not like yesterday. Yesterday she was so kind and even hugged me. I held him close, stroking his hair, feeling a fire of fear and confusion burn inside. "Your mom was tired, honey. Don't be sad," I murmured, but my voice shook. Matthew buried his face in my shoulder and whispered, "Grandma, I want the mom from yesterday." His words stabbed at me, confirming my worst suspicions. That night sleep evaded me. I lay awake, eyes wide open, images replaying. Araceli in the yellow dress entering the alley, Araceli in the white blouse in the kitchen, Ivan's words about the woman on the flight. Trembling, I retrieved my notebook and wrote a single line. "Maybe they are not the same person." Felt like a curse. The next morning I resolved to return to that alley. I clutched the family photo of Araceli smiling next to Stephen and Matthew, holding it tightly for courage. The alley was just as silent and shadowed as before. I stopped by a corn stand where a middle-aged woman fanned the coals for her roasting corn. Showing her the photo, I asked, "Excuse me, have you seen this young woman around here?" She studied it carefully, then nodded. "Oh yes, she comes and goes all the time from the house at number 14 right over there." My heart pounded. I was closer to the truth than I had ever been, but fear kept every step heavy. I thanked the woman and walked toward the house at number 14, my heart hammering in my chest. The house looked worn and forgotten, with peeling paint, a crooked wooden door, and a pot holding a wilted daisy on the windowsill. My hands trembled as I knocked, each tap echoing like a warning. When the door opened, I froze. Standing before me was a young woman who looked exactly like Araceli. Her face, her figure, even her long black hair. But her eyes were wide with fear and her hands shook as she clutched a rag. "Araceli," I managed to whisper. The woman jumped, tried to close the door, but another voice stopped her. Calm yet firm, it said, "Isadora, don't hide anymore. You know this is wrong." A second young woman stepped out from a corner, her hair in a neat bun, her expression intelligent and gentle. "Mrs. Brooks, my name is Lucy Miller. Isadora's roommate. Please come in. It's time you know the truth." I took a shaky breath and stepped into the small house, the air faintly smelling of disinfectant, the cracked concrete floor and stained walls pressing in on me. In one corner, an elderly man coughed weakly on a worn cot. I forced myself to sit in the wooden chair Lucy offered. The woman who looked like Araceli lowered her head, her voice barely audible. "I'm sorry. I'm not Araceli. My name is Isadora." My mind spun, torn between disbelief and recognition. I clasped my hands tightly and asked, "Then why do you look exactly like my daughter-in-law? And why have you been at my house?" Isadora hesitated, guilt written across her face. Lucy poured her a glass of water and spoke gently. "Mrs. Brooks, Isadora comes from a very poor family. She hasn't had much, and this has been her only way to survive." I sat there, my heart racing, knowing that what I was about to hear would finally explain the impossible mystery that had haunted my family for weeks. Lucy explained that Isadora's adoptive parents were very sick, especially the elderly gentleman lying on the cot, and they needed expensive medication. A few years ago, Isadora had met Araceli by chance at a market, and the resemblance between them was striking. Araceli saw an opportunity and asked Isadora to pretend to be her for short periods whenever she wanted, offering a large sum of money. At first, Isadora refused, but she couldn't turn it down because her parents' health depended on it. I looked at Isadora, who sat with her head bowed, hands gripping the rag so tightly her knuckles were white. Replace her for what? I asked, my voice tight with disbelief. She looked up, voice shaking. She would tell me to stay in the house for a few hours, go to the market, care for the boy. Then she paid me enough to buy medicine. I didn't dare ask for more. Tears ran down her cheeks and suddenly all the strange details made sense. The left and right handwriting, the sweet one day and cold the next, the moods, everything. Lucy added with a sharp glance. I also saw her with a very elegant man, Charles Thompson. They called each other honey at a coffee shop. Isadora was outside in the car, confused. My mind went back to Ivan's words about the first-class passenger, and a cold shock ran through me. My hands trembled so badly that I knocked over a glass and Lucy hurried to help, but I waved her off, my voice catching. Araceli is deceiving my family. Isadora sobbed, her voice choked. I'm so sorry, ma'am. I never wanted to hurt anyone. I just wanted to save my parents. I looked at the young woman whose face was so much like Araceli's, but her eyes were full of fear, pain, and regret. Part of me wanted to be angry, to shout, but seeing Isadora's trembling hands and tear-streaked face, I felt only pity. She wasn't the one in control, she was just caught in Araceli's scheme. My world seemed to crumble around me as I tried to steady my voice. Isadora, do you know where Araceli is? Do you know what she does when she asks you to pretend to be her? She shook her head, still crying. I don't know, ma'am. She just told me to do what she asked and promised to pay me. I didn't dare ask for more. Lucy reached over and placed a comforting hand on Isadora's shoulder before speaking gently to me. Mrs. Brooks, I know this is hard, but Isadora is a victim too. She had no choice. I looked around the small, worn house, listening to the faint cough of the man on the cot. I understood her desperation, yet the feeling of betrayal weighed heavily on me. I clenched my fists, holding back tears. I don't blame you, Isadora, but I need the truth. I have to protect my son and my grandson. Rising, I felt as if the world itself were collapsing. Thank you, Lucy, for telling me, I said, my voice tight. I'll be back. Outside the sun was bright, but my heart felt cold. The next morning I returned to the alley, the small house at number 14 looming in my mind like a shadow I couldn't shake. Holding the family photo tightly, I knocked on the peeling wooden door, my heart thundering. This time Isadora opened it with a calmer, quieter expression and invited me in. Mrs. Brooks, I was expecting you. Please come in. The house smelled faintly of disinfectant, the old man still coughing softly on his cot. I sat in the wooden chair, studying Isadora, who now looked tired but no longer frightened. Taking a deep breath, I asked quietly, Isadora, I need to meet your adoptive mother. I need to understand all of this better. She nodded and led me to a corner of the room where a frail, very thin woman with white hair lay in bed, her eyes clouded as she stared at the ceiling. She was Mrs. Jones, Isadora's adoptive mother. I gently took her hand. I'm Stella Brooks, Stephen's mother. She struggled to speak, her voice soft and weak. Isadora is not my blood. She's a child I adopted when she was just a newborn. Her words hit me like a thunderbolt. I froze, my heart racing, but I tried to steady my voice. Please tell me everything, I whispered. Mrs. Jones coughed weakly and began her story slowly, her voice quivering. Years ago she had been a nurse in a small town when a very poor family came to the hospital with twins. They were so destitute they couldn't keep both children. The mother cried, saying she could only care for one and would have to give up the other. Mrs. Jones couldn't bear to let the baby be abandoned, so she adopted her, Isadora. She paused, looking at Isadora with a tenderness that made my chest ache. I raised her as my own, but she's always wanted to know her real parents. All I could give her was my love and this home. My hands gripped the chair tightly as I tried to process her words. Do you know who her biological parents are? I asked, voice trembling. She shook her head. Only that they were poor from a nearby town. I never asked more, I just wanted to save the child. I looked at Isadora, her face bowed, tears streaming down her cheeks. Mrs. Brooks, I don't know anything about them, she said, her voice breaking. When I met Araceli, I thought maybe she knew something, she looks so much like me, but she never said a word. I felt my chest tighten. Mrs. Jones gestured to an old wooden dresser and handed me a yellowed envelope with Isidora's hospital records. My hands shook as I opened it and read the papers. Her date of birth was exactly the same as Araceli's, the one I had seen on her marriage documents. My heart stopped. You and Araceli could be twin sisters, I whispered, my voice barely audible. Isidora collapsed into tears, burying her face in her hands. So Arai is my sister. Why didn't she tell me? Why did she make me do all of that? I felt my own heart shatter. I remembered the confident, radiant Araceli I had welcomed into my home, the daughter-in-law I had loved and trusted, believing she would bring happiness to Stephen and Matthew. Now I realized the truth. She had deceived my family and used her own sister as a pawn in a secret I hadn't even dared to imagine. I stood up and placed my hand gently on Isidora's shoulder, trying to keep my voice steady even though my heart was heavy. Isidora, from today on no one will take advantage of you again. I'll help your parents with their illness, but I need your full cooperation. We have to bring the truth to light, for Stephen, for Matthew. She nodded through her tears, her voice trembling. I will help, Mrs. Brooks. I don't want to live this lie anymore. Seeing the sincerity in her eyes, a small spark of hope stirred in me amid the chaos. I left the little house and walked through the alley, my mind spinning. The market was busy and bright, full of chatter and laughter, yet all I could hear were Mrs. Jones's words ringing in my head. Two twins, one abandoned, one raised, now crossing paths in my own family. Returning home, my heart felt heavy, weighed down by the secret of Araceli and Isidora, the truth I wasn't ready to confront with my daughter-in-law and the family I had to protect. That evening I called Ivan, forcing my voice to sound firm even as it trembled. Ivan, you need to come home tomorrow night. There are things I need you to clarify. His voice immediately carried concern. Mom, did something serious happen? I kept it simple. Just come, honey. I need you, and bring Araceli's electronic passport if you can. He didn't ask another question. His mom. I'll be there. Hanging up, I sat down, feeling the weight of the world pressing down on me. I knew tomorrow night would be unforgettable for this family. Early the next day, I prepared a special family dinner. I spread a crisp white tablecloth, lit a few candles, and cooked Stephen's favorite chili and Matthew's favorite roasted fish. This dinner wasn't about celebration. It was about marking a turning point, a before and after that would change everything in our lives. I was in the kitchen chopping vegetables, but my mind kept drifting back to that dark alley and Isidora's trembling words. I told myself I had to be strong, for Stephen, for Matthew, but each slice felt like a stab in my own heart. Stephen arrived just as dusk settled in, tired from work, and froze when he saw the table overflowing with food. What are we celebrating? Why all this, Mom? He asked. I forced a calm smile. I just wanted a nice dinner for all of us. Sit down, honey. Araceli entered, wearing her light blue dress, her soft smile hiding a flicker of nervousness, while Matthew ran to hug my legs. Grandma, the fish smells amazing, he exclaimed, and I patted his head, knowing that after tonight, his innocence might never feel the same. We sat down, and for a moment the table was lively. Stephen talking about work, Matthew excitedly showing his school drawing, Araceli nodding and speaking softly. But I noticed her hand trembling slightly as she held her spoon. I took a steadying breath and gave Ivan a subtle nod. He walked in, followed closely by Isidora in a simple dress, her face identical to Araceli's but full of fear and sadness. Silence fell instantly. Matthew blinked at the two women and asked innocently, "Why are there two moms?" Stephen went pale and dropped his spoon while Araceli leapt to her feet. "What is this about, Mom?" she demanded. I gripped the edge of the table to keep from shaking. "Sit down, Araceli," I said slowly but firmly. "It's time we clear everything up." I began recounting the story. The phone call from Ivan when he saw her on a plane to France while she was still at home, the days she switched hands to write, the sudden changes in her moods, and finally, my visit to the alley where I met Isidora and uncovered the secret of the twins. "You and Isidora are twin sisters," I said, looking Araceli directly in the eyes. "You used your own sister to hide the truth. Now tell us, what is really going on?" Araceli's face turned pale as paper. She trembled and yelled, trying to defend herself. "She's making it all up to humiliate me." "How could you say that?" she shouted, but Ivan calmly stepped forward and dropped a stack of papers onto the table with a firm sound. This is a copy of your travel record, he said steadily. It shows you went to France. You can't be here and there at the same time. Araceli stared at the papers, her face tight, unable to speak. Then Matthew, sitting beside her, spoke in his small, hurting voice. It's true, Grandma. Some days my mom is very kind and other days she's really harsh. I don't like the harsh mom. His words cut straight through my heart, and the room suddenly felt heavy and hard to breathe in. I nodded and signaled to Lucy, who had just entered quietly. She looked at everyone and said firmly, I saw Araceli with a man named Charles Thompson. They were acting very close, and she was the one who paid Isadora to take her place and fool the family. Stephen turned to his wife, his voice shaking. Is it true? Please tell me the truth. Araceli stayed silent for a long moment, then suddenly burst out, saying she was tired of this life and wanted something richer and easier, and that Charles promised her a better future. Her words hit the room like a storm. Stephen stood frozen, his hands shaking, while Matthew started crying and ran to cling to me, asking what his mother meant. I held him tightly as tears ran down my face. Araceli stood there cold and distant, without even a sign of regret. Stephen stood up slowly and asked in a broken voice if she truly meant all that. I had spent my entire life caring for my family, but now I felt like someone standing in the middle of a storm's aftermath, surrounded by the broken pieces of the home I had loved so dearly. Araceli had stormed out, leaving Stephen empty and lost, and Matthew with tears that no child should ever shed. I knew things would never be the same. A week later, Stephen and Araceli went to the courthouse for the divorce. I stayed home, but Stephen told me afterward, his voice flat and drained. Mom, she didn't even look at me or Matthew. She signed the papers and left with that man like we never mattered. I sat beside him, taking his hand, trying to hold back my own tears. She hadn't asked for custody of Matthew, as if he had been nothing more than a part in her story. My heart ached, not just for Stephen but for my little grandson, a 7-year-old boy who didn't deserve to feel abandoned. Don't worry, honey, I whispered, my voice trembling. I'll always be here. Matthew will never be without love. But I knew the wounds we carried would take time to heal. Stephen shut himself off, speaking little, burying himself in work or quietly watching Matthew play in the yard, his eyes shadowed with the same grief Raphael had worn in his last days. I wanted to tell him everything would be okay, but I didn't know how to begin. Then Isadora appeared, like a quiet light breaking through the darkness. She came every day, bringing warm food, playing with Matthew and gently wiping his tears when he asked, Auntie, where did Mom really go? I watched her carefully, that face so much like Araceli's, but her heart completely different. Gentle, patient, and full of love. One afternoon, Matthew ran to her with excitement, calling out, Mom, Isadora, teach me to draw a little bird. My chest tightened as I realized the boy was smiling again, carefree, and calling her Mom without hesitation. A joy I hadn't seen in far too long. Isadora laughed softly and stroked Matthew's head. Of course, my love, but you have to make it very pretty so I can see it. I stood there, tears streaming down my cheeks. Matthew's innocent words were like a balm for my wounded heart. I realized then that Isadora, who had once been caught in Aurelie's deception, was now becoming a true part of our family, with a heart full of sincerity and love. One evening, as I was cleaning the kitchen, Stephen called me to the living room. He stood there, holding a small ring with hands that trembled from both nerves and hope. Beside him, Isadora's face glowed, her eyes shining with anticipation. Stephen knelt, his voice breaking as he said, Isadora, I don't want to waste another moment. You brought light back to me and Matthew. Will you be my wife and Matthew's mom? Isadora broke down in tears, glancing at me as if seeking my blessing. I walked over, gently took her hand and nodded. You deserve it, honey. You've been part of this family for a long time. She hugged me, her tears soaking my shoulder, and in that moment, I knew our family had begun to heal. Stephen and Isadora's wedding was simple but overflowing with love. I watched from the yard as red roses tied to the fence swayed gently in the breeze, while Matthew, dressed in his little suit, laughed as he proudly acted as his dad's tiny best man. Ivan flew back from a work trip and stood beside his brother, smiling as brightly as the day he first donned his pilot's uniform. I sat in the front row, tears streaming down my cheeks, not tears of loss but of pure joy. I looked at Isadora in her simple, elegant dress, holding Stephen's hand, and felt a deep sense of relief and happiness. Our family had finally found a sincere, loving heart. Life returned to its gentle rhythm. Isadora continued to care for Stephen and Matthew with unwavering love. She cooked warm meals, sang Matthew to sleep with the same Silito Lindo I had sung to my sons, and each night sat beside Stephen, listening to his plans and dreams with a look of pride and devotion. Our home, once shattered by betrayal, had been rebuilt with trust, love, and the kind of happiness that lasts. Matthew no longer asked about his other mom. He simply snuggled with Isadora, calling her mom with a radiant smile. I looked at my family and felt the wounds slowly begin to heal. One late night I sat on the porch. The soft wind carried the scent of the garden, while inside, Matthew's laughter mingled with Isadora's gentle voice. I peeked in and saw Stephen deeply focused on his work, while Isadora prepared a cup of tea for him, placing it beside him and pressing a soft kiss to his forehead. I smiled, feeling my heart finally at peace as I thought about the long road that had brought us here, from the first unsettling doubts to Ivan's call, to that dark alley where I discovered the truth. The truth had been harsh, but as my husband Raphael used to say, the truth will set you free, Stella. And it did. The truth freed us. It brought Isadora into our lives and gave our family a new beginning, brighter and happier than I could have imagined. The story you've just heard has been altered in names and places to protect the identities of those involved. We do not share it to judge, but in the hope that someone listening might pause and reflect on the silent struggles of mothers everywhere. That if you were in my place, what would you do? Would you stay silent to maintain peace? Or would you gather your courage and face everything to reclaim your voice? I would love to hear your thoughts because every story is like a candle. It can light the way for someone else. God bless, and I truly believe that courage always leads us to better days. Meanwhile, on the final screen, I'm leaving you with two of the channel's most beloved stories. I'm sure they will surprise and move you. Thank you for staying with me until this moment.